All right, welcome back to AP Human Geography Unit 7 review. This one we are going to look at industry, right, which is Chapter 11 in your book, right? Gentle reminder that this is for the Unit 7 exam. We'll also talk a little bit about FRQs at the end of this. All right, so Chapter 11 covers industry, and generally speaking, we broke this down into 11.1 and 11.4 together, and then 11.2 and 11.3 together because they tend to go together really well. Right. So let's talk about what industry is. It's a secondary sector. It's manufacturing of goods in a factory, adding value to a product or service. Right. Keep in mind, back in the day, it used to be operating out of homes, which we would call a cottage industry. Keep in mind that also that this is very clustered. Right, you're going to see this in 3 industrial regions, but then we are also seeing this growing trend of moving from MDCs to LDCs, deindustrialization. All right. So we can see that in terms of the United States, right, and its manufacturing jobs, right, and this is employment. Keep in mind that our productivity, we still make a lot of stuff, but we're using things like automation, right, and so jobs are becoming more scarce, right, as they are either moving overseas or they are becoming automated. All right, and we can see this affecting the Rust Belt region a little bit more so than other parts. All right, so keep in mind that we do have an origin of industry that started in England in the 1700s. It correlates really well with the second agricultural revolution, and then there's an urban revolution that happens, and then there's the industrial revolution, and this leads to stage 2. So all of those things are all kind of tied together. Right, the Industrial Revolution is a great time for a huge amount of social changes. You see economic, political, and social changes happening there. We see a lot of new inventions. The key invention being Watt's steam engine. Right, all of this is going to lead to higher productivity and a higher standard of living. So we start to see things like the middle class starting to emerge out of the Industrial Revolution, and then ideas about like communism and socialism start to emerge during this time. But the steam engine is pretty important because you also then start to see increased production in iron and steel. You see coal being used as the primary fuel, particularly at this time. It burns hot, right, and longer, so it's good for making steel, turning iron into steel. Right, and then we'd also see that with steamships and locomotives. We see coal burning steamships and locomotives as well, and then we also see mechanization, right, start to happen on a bigger level, much bigger level. Textile mills being a good example of that. All right, so remember that with this steam engine and all of these other innovations, textiles and chemicals really help, right, when it comes to that. Textiles, spinning frames, they needed to be near water sources at that point, right, for a spinning wheel. But then you also then have chemicals such as bleach, right, and dyeing textiles. We see food processing happening as well, which leads to a lot more preservation of foods, like sterilization and canning, right? So that leads to then the second agricultural revolution, leading into all of those, right? They help each other, right? That urban revolution, the agricultural revolution, and the industrial revolution. So also transportation improvements, right? Help move things and people around quicker. All right, so there's an early English textile mill, right? Notice the gender and the hiring of women, particularly single women as well, because they're a very exploited group at that time, and probably still are, right? So keep in mind our industrial revolutions. Our regions. Sorry, we have 3 major ones. The first 2 are Europe and North America. Europe is the original industrialized place, right? It's the first to industrialize. The United Kingdom is the first in Europe to industrialize, but then we also have these other regions that work as well, right? Mid-Atlantic is going to be and the Northeast are going to be your original spots in North America. Over in the Northeast, you're going to see textiles. Keep in mind that there's a connection between the cotton industry in the South, right, and the textile mills in the North. There's lots of ports. There's access to large markets, particularly European markets, right? That's the closest spot. So you see that as well. But also note that the Rust Belt and Southern California have these things as well. And this part, understanding the North American industrial map is very key to the 5-point matching section, where you're going to see 5 things. Points in North America, and you're going to line them up with either what or what their traits are. Right. So there's the major industrial regions. We haven't talked about East Asia yet. Right. But keep in mind this one, right? Understanding what happens in there, and you can read that in your books. I would go back and I would take a look at what happens in each spot there, and be able to know a little bit about kind of comparative advantages and things like that. So there's North America, right? This graphic will help you quite a bit. All right, there's East Asia, our third industrial region. All right, note the difference between China and Japan, right? Japan has a large skilled labor force. It has a high, a big education system that helps with that. And it's known for high-end electronics, cars, things like that. Right, and we see this emerge after World War II. China, on the other hand, has the largest labor pool, but also has the largest market. Remember, there's 1.3 billion people who live there and work there, but they also then buy things as well. Right, so textile, Chinese steel is a big thing, and then consumer goods. But the consumer goods are generally, if we had to generalize between Japanese goods and Chinese goods, Japanese are going to be more high end and operate in terms of the electronics and the cars. Right. So there's comparative advantages there in East Asia, right? And that leads us then into site and situation factors. And we'll start with site factors. Site factors being labor, land, and capital, right? And they are unique characteristics of a specific location. So this is where you start to think, where would I put my factory, right? And these factors are going to play in. So we'll talk about those, and we'll also talk about situation factors when it comes to raw materials and Weber's least cost theory. All right, so labor is the most important site factor there is, right? So it's most important on a global scale. Keep in mind there's a large variation in wages. That a Chinese worker working Chinese hours for Chinese wages is way different than an American worker working American hours for American wages. So you do see that. So you see a high clustering in India and China when it comes to industrial workers, right? And then we get into labor-intensive industries, and these are industries. And the best example of this is your textile industry, right, where the cost of the parts, right, is much less than the cost of hiring the people to put things together. Right, so these are wages make up most production costs in textiles, right? Other labor-intensive industries. That you can think of, right, where you don't have a lot of inputs, right, but you do have to pay your workers, right? The opposite of that is automobiles, right, and that's a capital intensive industry, right? And all the things that are put, all the parts that are used to put together an automobile are very, very expensive, right? And they far outweigh the cost of paying the people to put them together. All right, so that gets us into Fordist and post-Fordist, right, ideas. Traditional factories are going to take a Fordist approach, where you're kind of a cog in a wheel. You're a number, not a name. You do repetitive tasks. You're easily replaceable. You don't need a lot of training. You don't need a lot of education. It's low-skill labor, right, and fairly isolating, and people feel like they're not necessarily attached to their job. They don't. It's not a fun place to work, right? Post-Fordist approach, right, is a little bit going to be, you're going to see more of this in developed countries and high-skilled industries, right? This is where skilled workers solve problems. They work in teams and they receive fair treatment. They're asked for their input. So if you track back to your Made in the USA documentary, you'll see that there. And then we also then use the word lean or flexible production that goes with post-Fordist approach. All right, so there's your textile costs, right? Keep in mind that the labor, notice the difference in labor, $5.50 versus $17 is going to be the biggest factor, even with import taxes, tariffs. You're going to see that, and increased shipping costs because it's so far away, that the vast difference in wages is going to make all the difference here, right? And so that's why your sweatshirts are going to be made, or in most of your clothes are going to be made not in the United States. All right, capital is a second site factor, right? And is wealth in the form of currency or capital. Use it to expand businesses. So think in terms of loans, but also then think about in terms of tax breaks and things like that, right? So it's not just your ability to gain capital, but it's your ability to save money too. Right, so Silicon Valley is a good example of a place that shows the banks in Silicon Valley were willing to finance tech startups, and so that's how it became agglomerated right there. All right, LDCs don't necessarily have those options, so you don't see that, but they make up for that by doing things like special export zones or export processing zones, EPZs or SEZs, right, which offer a lot of sweet incentives to lure factories away from MDCs and into LDCs, right? And they can offer a whole lot of incentives, right? To do that. So that's an EPZ and an SEZ are going to be the same thing, right? As you can see, essentially for all you need to know, right? Zones established by countries in the periphery and semi-periphery. So we're using Chapter 10 terminology here. Offer favorable taxes, regulatory and trade arrangements. They're going to offer sweet deals to attract foreign investment, right? And that's going to rapidly change these areas because we all know why people move, right? People move for jobs. That's the number one factor. And if there's jobs, then all of a sudden you're going to see a rapid urbanization of these areas. You're going to see housing shortages. You're going to see all sorts of different things happening when an EPZ is established. Right. Our third factor is land, right? And land is, the land that you use to build the factory on. Right. Early factories, you're going to see them in city centers because you didn't have transportation for places to go. That's where your customers were. That's where your workers were. But keep in mind that urban centers lack suitable space, right? And they are near rail lines to get your product in and out of those urban centers, but you also are going to need to have like multiple story buildings and all of that. Modern factories, on the other hand, are going to be operating in either suburban areas or rural areas. They're going to be very close to highway junctions, right? In terms of trucking, right? Transportation, and also maybe railway lines, things like that. So think the Wakota Bridge that you cross over, right? And how industrialized that area is. You're going to get cheaper land out there, so you can build big one-story buildings. You have the space. So again, think about intensive land use in a city center versus extensive land use out in the suburbs. So channel that urban geography as well. All right, compare that one, right, to this one, and you can see the differences. So that leads us, those are our site factors. Energy is our fourth site factor, and that is the ability to get cheap energy. And you might see that a little bit in the United States near Niagara Falls, where you have cheap electricity from hydroelectricity, and the aluminum industry is going to agglomerate there. The other way to look at this is situation factors, right? And how near you are. And that is going to be factors that involve transportation costs. How do you save money transporting your goods, right? Whether that be two things, the raw material, the things that go, your inputs, the things that go into the factory, as opposed to your outputs, the things that come out of your factory. And you need to weigh that. As a factory, you got to figure out if you're a bulk gaining industry or a bulk reducing industry, right? So factory locations based on the cost of importing raw materials and the cost of transporting finished products, right? This is known as Weber's least cost theory. Alfred Weber, right, creates this thing, right? And if all things are equal, land, labor, and capital, if they're all the same, and you need to start thinking about transportation costs. Right. So we'll start with bulk reducing, right? If your raw materials, right, are cheaper to transport than your finished product, right, is cheaper to transport than your raw materials. So what comes in is heavy, right, and what comes out is less heavy. Then you have a bulk reducing industry. Steel and copper are a good example of that. Steel mills, the two major inputs are iron ore, which are very, very heavy, right, and then you have coal, which is used in that process to heat up the iron ore and create the steel. Copper also comes in big bulks and comes out in small little things. So what goes in is big, really, really heavy, and what comes out is a lot less heavy. And if that's the case, then you are going to your optimal location is near the source of the raw materials. right? You don't want to haul the heavy stuff. Keep that in mind. You just don't want to haul the heavy stuff. So that's the bulk of Weber's least cost theory is you want to set up near where the heavy stuff is, right? So bulk reducing, again, we look at this. This is, again, right on the Wakota Bridge. You see that, right? This is what comes in and this is what comes out. What's cheaper? Right, to transport. These steel rods are way cheaper. The rebar is way cheaper than the inputs, all that, all those broken cars. Right, so you see steel mills again are going to be located near the coal and near the iron ore, as opposed to in the southern part of the United States or in the western part of the United States where those aren't, because you don't want to haul all those heavy things to create the steel. You want to create the steel and then haul that steel. Right. So again, we look at bulk reducing mineral resources around the world. We can tie that into kind of our 11.2, 11.3 as well. Right. The opposite of this is going to be bulk gaining. Right. And that's where you put a bunch of small things together and create a big thing. Right. Things like cars, beverages, machinery are going to be great examples of that. And that's where your finished product, your output, is more expensive to transport than your raw materials. So where do you put it? You put it near where you're going to sell it, because you don't want to haul the big stuff very far. Remember that. You don't want to haul the heavy stuff very far. It's too expensive to do so, right? Or it's it's more expensive to do so. So cars are going to be a good example of that. A bunch of things come together and you come out with a 2-ton thing. All right. Other things we look at that should be near markets, single market manufacturers, things like car parts are going to be a good example. Perishable goods as well. Right, bakeries, dairy, fruit. Right, so channel your Von Tunen model as well. Right, newspapers. You can't have a newspaper being printed for the Twin Cities news in China. Right, it's not going. By the time it gets here, it's going to be far outdated. Right. So we look at our transportation systems, right? Truck, train, ship, and air. They all have different advantages and disadvantages. Keep in mind that containerization is a huge piece, right? Containerization allows for quick transfer between nodes. So channel your containerization video, which there's a TED Talks on containerization that you should see, and that's some pretty good stuff, right? When there are multiple methods, and generally there are, where those transfer of goods from one transportation method to another is called break of bulk point. Don't forget that. All right. So a good example, you see containerization. These container ships come in to Long Beach, right? And then they aren't everything isn't unpacked, right? Only the container is unpacked, and then they are loaded onto things like train cars, right? Or trucks, and they become the container. You don't have to unload everything. And that is incredibly efficient, and it reduces transportation costs a lot. So your sweatshirt, instead of costing $5 to transport, only costs $1.70 to transport because of containerization. Containerization is amazing. All right, so there's just-in-time delivery as well. Those are things that is another factor that would lead you to put your industry near a market, right? And again, that's kind of single market manufacturing would work as well. So these are things that are ordered just in time. Their parts and materials are ordered just before they are needed in an industry. Car parts are the best example of that. So manufacturers don't have to have any wasted inventory. They don't have to store things. They don't need to have warehouses full of parts. They just call up and say, "Hey, we need 300 parts of this by 2:00 tomorrow. Please get there." Right. And that what it means is if you are selling to these single market manufacturers like car assembly plants, you need to locate very near there so you can meet that order. Right. And again, it also keeps labor rest and weather and all of those things. It reduces those effects by having that. Which leads us then to why you would keep a factory in an MDC. Now, we've already talked about labor being a huge factor here, right? And we're going to talk about this with the new International Division of Labor, right? Which is also associated with the word outsourcing. Right. Really, what we're looking at is if you are if your industry has low skill workers, you're going to do that overseas, right? Because you can pay workers significantly less to do so, right? And if a worker is a worker, they're all the same. They're low skilled, they're unskilled. you don't really, it doesn't matter, right? So why would you pay Americans to do low skill work when you can pay, a fourth, a fifth of the price of the wage to have it done overseas, right? And again, we look at Fortis approach as well. Keep that in mind, right? High skilled factory jobs are going to stay in MDCs. They are going to stay because you need those skills, and you're going to see that in an MDC has a lot of skilled workers, right? They have a high education. You have that tied to development, right? You see a lot of more educated workforce, and so that's going to keep those high skilled MDC factories still in MDCs. All right. Also, access to large markets. So you're going to see car manufacturing because the United States is a huge car country, right? That's going to be huge as well, right? Transportation costs, so bulk gaining, right? Industries are going to maybe stay in MDCs if their market is in an MDC. It's going to be close to the market. So just in time delivery, and then bulk gaining industries, right? And then high skilled jobs are going to stay in MDCs. Low skilled jobs are not. All right, vertical integration. One of you're gonna probably want to know that it's the company owning all processes of the production. You don't see that as much. You see outsourcing, and you see companies being able to specialize and do a certain part of the commodity chain done. They specialize in that piece, right? So it's a Fortis approach, right? It's the opposite of outsourcing. Why, we're going to do it ourselves as opposed to pay other people. Distance was important. It's not as important now because transportation containerization has dropped all of that down. On to our emerging industrial locations. Mexico, good example. So you have the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, which used to be called NAFTA, is kind of like the European Union in that it reduces tariffs and hassles at the border. So you get cheap labor, right? But again, not as cheap as Southeast Asia, not as cheap as India, not as cheap as China, right? But also has low environmental standards, and it is very close to the United States. So Mexico, right, has that situation factor and that site factor as well in terms of cheap labor and low environmental standards. And so you see factories called maquiladoras, which are on the border, right? They're in Mexico, but they're right on the border. So they butt up right to the market of the United States, right? But they can employ cheaper Mexican labor, right, and have laxer environmental standards, right, and safety standards too. So maquiladora process, here's a good look at that, understand what a maquiladora is. Other emerging industrial locations are going to be your BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Cheap, abundant labor you see in India. You see your inputs in terms of Brazil and Russia having a lot of resources, natural resources inputs, right? And so we look at those numbers right in here and what they do, and if they all kind of work together. And again, that's kind of it's more of an ideal than what actually happens in reality, right? That Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa don't all pool. They don't have a NAFTA or a EU situation, but if they did, right, they would be a powerhouse if they all got together. Right. So again, we look at labor intensive industries and site factors. We look at what is made, and we use textiles as an example. We do see the further up the commodity chain we get closer to the finished product. You might see sewing and assembly closer to the U.S. market and a little bit more specialized, as opposed to things like the spinning or the weaving. That's going to happen in India and China. Right. Again, cheap, abundant labor. Right. Again, we look at this one. You saw this earlier. Right. Here's another one that we look at. Right. There's freight and insurance duties. Right. Material and finished articles. Right. And then we look at labor happening here. The total cost of the retailer. So this is fairly fascinating. Right. Labor is 12 cents. Right. Per shirt. That's not a lot. All right, that is not a lot. All right, let's talk about how industrial locations are changing within the United States, right? You see a shift from the Northeast to the South and the West. A lot of that has to do with the Northeast being that traditional powerhouse, but after the Civil War, you do see the South, you see modernization happening, right? That it's no longer kind of the backwoods of the United States. It is as modern as any other place. And then you also see right to work laws, right? Right to work laws are laws that are implemented by a state that make it harder. You're not required to join a union, so it makes it harder for unions to operate there because you are not required to join a union. In union states, you are required to join a union, right? And so that if you belong to a certain industry, and so that limits the ability of unions to collectively bargain and to go on strike and things like that, to organize, if you will. And so right to work laws are put into states if they want to attract industry, right? Because workers generally get paid less in right to work situations, and they don't have the union backing them, right? So that's an important piece to think about: union versus non-union states, and that if you are building a factory in the United States, a brand new one, you might want to do it in a right-to-work state because you don't necessarily have as strong a union presence. Europe also, you see a shift from the northwest to the southeast, and this is the EU working, right? They're going to kind of spread out their industry to promote development across the board. Right? Keep in mind that you still retain skilled labor, but it's a little cheaper, right? And you still have access to markets within the EU. Right. So there's your employment, manufacturing. Notice by 2017, the amount of right to work states there's more right to work states than there isn't. As well, and notice that it is spread almost the entire southeast part of the United States is right to work, right? So you also see this. Here's your purple is where industry traditionally was, and then you're looking at the orange being convergence regions, where you're going to see that spread out just a little bit. All right. Our last section is 11.2 and 11.3. Why do industries face energy challenges, and do industries face pollution challenges? You are not going to see as many questions on this section on the exam, but there are some things that we do need to go over. Right. So keep in mind, how does it affect industry? You have supply and demand, right? Understanding kind of the economic base of is there a quantity that is available, and is it readily available? How much of it is available, and then how much is needed, right? How much do people wish to consume or are able to buy, right? And when supply is high and demand is low, then the cost of whatever we're talking about goes way down. If supply is limited, if there's only a limited number of things and demand is very high and everybody wants it, like Super Bowl tickets, right? The price is going to go way, way up. All right. So you saw that in the pandemic. You saw that with things like toilet paper, right? And antibacterial stuff, right? So developed countries, you need to know that developed countries consume the most energy, right? We have the most stuff in developed countries, and so we have more cars, right? We have more electronics, so we use a lot more energy than developing countries, right? But keep in mind that most energy sources are found in developing countries, so you can start to tie the neocolonialism and the core peripheral model, all of those things as well, right? Understand what a fossil fuel is, right? Coal, natural gas, and petroleum are going to be our big things when we look at that, right? So there's our energy supplies, right? And how we use things. Keep in mind that petroleum is about a third, right? You have coal, and you have natural gas, right? And so how do we use what are our energy supplies? And the book does go on about a lot of those things. Keep in mind that energy demand, even though the developed regions, remember, there's only 1 out of every 5 people in the world live in a developed region, right? 4 out of every 5 live in a developing region, and so you can see the disproportionate amount of energy that developed countries, right? They're going to use somewhere in the, what do we got, 30, 40, 45, 46%, almost half, right? Pushing up on half, not quite half of the energy, even though it's only 20% of the world's population. Right, so you'll see that, and also note that China, right, and the United States are our biggest users of energy. China is the biggest. All right. We also look at, terms of developing versus developed, right? And we can see this happening, that developing countries are going to increase their demand as a middle class emerges. As populations increase, you're going to see a massive increase for energy, right? Demand that's coming from developing countries as we move through. All right, so there's our energy usage. Keep in mind that all of the things that go into our products, and those are hidden costs, right? Those are things we don't think about. And so the book uses orange juice as a good example of that. All right, understand the difference between proven and potential, right? And then unconventional resource, not considered, like oil sands, hydroelectric fracturing, fracking, if you will. Those are things that are going to be things that you need to think about. Understand the difference between proven and potential, right? You haven't quite gotten to. We think that there's potential reserves. Proven is it's here, it's there and now, right? So there's your fossil fuels. Understand, look at Russia as a big producer of petroleum. Look at the OPEC nations as well, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. We're going to see Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian countries, and also Latin American countries as well. So there is coal, right, and petroleum, and then natural gas as well. Canada, right, is going to be a big for all three of those. Right. So, what does the United States? What do they have to do? Right. We have to look at how do we meet our demand for petroleum. Domestic production is on the rise. Right. It is. It's pretty big, right? But keep in mind that we are also very reliant on places like Middle Eastern countries, right? OPEC nations, and also Canada as well. Right. Other things to look at: understand what a renewable energy source is, right? And things like biomass, wind power, geothermal power as well. Right. Understand recycling and then remanufacturing, what those two things are. Understand remanufacturing is a big piece here when it comes to what you put into your industrial pieces. Right. So you see that as well, and European countries are pretty good at that. Right. So we are into recycling and remanufacturing, and you can see again where that is happening, and it is on the rise. Right, and you see that as well here, right, and you see that happening here as well. These are possible FRQs, and if you hung around till the end, they're not word for word, but I will tell you that the self-sufficiency and international trade approach, advantages and disadvantages, isn't going to be one of them, right? So know your 5 models, your 5 stages of the Rostov model, know your world systems theory, that could happen as well, and then also know your statistics that would indicate levels of development, so your chapter 10 stuff, your create your own HDI, those things as well. All right, good luck, get after it.